For most of the 19th century, the systems that governed slavery in the United States depended on uncertainty. Not confusion, but controlled ambiguity. Names could change, origins could be blurred, lineage could be ignored. Records existed to manage labor and property, not to preserve identity. As long as individuals remained difficult to trace, the system functioned without friction. Order depended not on truth, but on what could be administratively maintained. This video is not about folklore, legend, or recovered memory. It is not about myth, and it is not about a forgotten hero. It is an examination of records, of what was written down, what was quietly removed, and what forced officials to respond in ways they rarely acknowledged. The figure at the center of this examination is not significant because of rebellion or violence. He became significant because the system was compelled to notice him. In the archives of the 19th century, attention is rarely dramatic. It does not arrive with declarations or accusations. It appears through repetition, a name that surfaces too often, a reference that refuses to disappear, a presence that generates paperwork where paperwork was never meant to accumulate. The system was designed to register existence only to the degree necessary to proceed. When documentation exceeded that threshold, it created a problem no statute was prepared to resolve. Jabari Mansa did not threaten the system with force. What made him visible was the trail that formed around him, mentions that crossed jurisdictions, records that did not remain isolated within a single ledger or a single plantation. When administrators were required to acknowledge continuity, when they could no longer treat an individual as interchangeable, the system was forced to react. To understand why this mattered, it is necessary to understand how enslaved people were normally recorded. Names were often incomplete, family connections were discouraged from appearing in official documentation, precision was avoided when it introduced claims the law could not accommodate, stability was maintained through omission. When identity remained vague, authority remained intact. What made Jabari Mansa anomalous was not what he asserted, but what the records began to imply. His existence generated documentation that could not be easily reconciled with the legal framework governing slavery. Each reference confirmed something the system preferred to leave unaddressed. Each acknowledgement created the need for another administrative response. This was not a confrontation between an individual and the law. It was a confrontation between documentation and a system that relied on selective recognition. The danger did not lie in speech or resistance, but in accumulation. Records are rarely neutral. They serve purposes, and when those purposes are threatened, the response is rarely public. What follows is an examination of how a system reacts when its own paperwork becomes disruptive. It is a study of administrative behavior, not moral awakening. The erasure that occurred was not emotional or impulsive. It was procedural. Names were adjusted, references disappeared, continuity was interrupted. What remained was enough to proceed, but not enough to explain. This is not a story that was erased completely. It is a story that was never allowed to finish writing itself. Before Jabari Mansa appeared in the records as an anomaly, it is necessary to understand how the system usually documented enslaved people, not in theory, but in practice. The mechanisms of record keeping were not designed to capture full lives. They were designed to facilitate control, transfer, and valuation. Identity, where it existed was secondary. In most plantation records, enslaved individuals were listed in ways that emphasized utility rather than personhood. Names were often abbreviated or altered. Ages were estimated rather than verified. Family relationships were rarely recorded with consistency. When they were mentioned, they appeared without detail and without continuity across documents. This was not an oversight, it was structural. Precision introduced complications the law did not want to manage. Lineage could imply inheritance, paternity could imply responsibility, continuity could suggest claims beyond labor. The system avoided these problems by ensuring that identity remained fragmented. A person might appear in one ledger under a name that never reappeared elsewhere. That fragmentation was not accidental, it was functional. Birth records, when they existed, reflected the same logic. They confirmed existence without elaboration. A child was recorded as born. A location was sometimes noted. A racial designation was assigned. Parental information was frequently omitted or recorded in ways that could not be legally leveraged. These documents established that someone existed within the system, but they did not establish who that person was beyond administrative necessity. The law reinforced this approach. Statutes governing slavery defined status without requiring comprehensive documentation. Legal recognition did not depend on recorded ancestry. In fact, ambiguity often served legal stability. The less that was known, the less that could be contested. Courts relied on this ambiguity. Property claims moved more smoothly when individuals could not be precisely traced across time. Labor could be reassigned without creating documentary contradictions. Authority was maintained by limiting what records were allowed to connect. In this environment, clerks were not encouraged to ask questions. They were trained to reproduce forms accurately and consistently. Deviations were discouraged not because they were illegal, but because they introduced uncertainty into a system that functioned best when ambiguity was controlled. Registers followed templates, ledgers repeated language, categories remained fixed even when reality did not fit cleanly within them. The appearance of order mattered more than correspondence to lived experience. Most importantly, records were not expected to accumulate around individuals. They were expected to remain isolated. A name appeared in one place for one purpose and then disappeared. When records followed a person across locations or years, they ceased to function as administrative tools and began to resemble evidence. That distinction mattered. The system could tolerate existence, it could tolerate labor, it could tolerate birth. What it could not tolerate was continuity. Continuity implied memory. Memory implied recognition. Recognition implied obligation. This is why most enslaved individuals left little trace across multiple archives, not because their lives were insignificant, but because the system was structured to prevent those lives from becoming legible over time. Against this backdrop, any deviation was noticeable. When documentation began to repeat, when names persisted, when references appeared where they were not expected. These were not dramatic events. There were no alarms, no immediate interventions, but they introduced friction into a system built to avoid it. And it is within that friction, quiet, procedural, and recorded without commentary, that Jabari Mansa begins to emerge. The first indication that something was wrong did not arrive as an accusation or a warning. It appeared as a repetition, a name that did not behave as expected. In a system where records were designed to remain isolated, one entry began to echo. At first, there was nothing remarkable about it. The name appeared in a register without a notation. No commentary followed. No distinction was made. It existed in the same format as thousands of other entries that preceded it. Had it appeared once, it would have passed unnoticed, but it did not appear once. The name surfaced again, not identically but recognizably. Spelling shifted slightly, placement changed, context varied, yet the reference remained persistent enough to be identifiable. It did not remain confined to a single ledger or a single administrative function. This alone was irregular. Most records were meant to be terminal. They served a purpose and then receded. They were not designed to follow individuals across time or geography. When a name reappeared, especially without clear explanation, it forced administrators to acknowledge continuity they were not equipped to manage. Jabari Mansa did not enter the system as a figure of consequence. He was not recorded as exceptional. The early references to him did not mark status, authority, or defiance. They simply recorded presence. But presence, when repeated, became visibility. As additional mentions accumulated, the system was confronted with a subtle disruption. Records that should have remained unrelated began to suggest connection. A name in one place could no longer be dismissed as incidental when it appeared elsewhere under similar circumstances. This created a problem that was not legal in nature but administrative. The issue was not that any single record violated statute. The issue was that together they began to imply something the system had no mechanism to address. Continuity introduced questions. Where did this individual originate? Why did the name persist? Why did references fail to dissolve into anonymity? These were not questions clerks were instructed to ask, but the structure of the records themselves began to raise them implicitly. In some cases, the name appeared in documents that required acknowledgement across jurisdictions, transfers, correspondence, internal reports that were never meant to be read as narratives. Each instance alone was insufficient to provoke concern. Together, they produced accumulation. Accumulation was the threat. The system tolerated ambiguity, but it did not tolerate patterns it could not flatten. Repetition undermined interchangeability. Persistence implied memory, and memory within a system designed to suppress it introduced instability. At no point was Jabari Mansa recorded as challenging authority. There is no evidence of confrontation in the records that survive. What exists instead is a paper trail that refused to behave predictably. The danger lay not in action, but in legibility. Once documentation became legible across contexts, it ceased to function as routine administration. It began to resemble something closer to identity. This was not anticipated by the system's design. Administrative structures rely on predictability. When records deviate from expected behavior, they generate internal friction. That friction does not immediately produce response. It produces hesitation, delays, reclassification, quiet adjustments that attempt to restore normal function. In the case of Jabari Mansa, those adjustments did not resolve the problem. The records continued to exist. They continued to connect. They continued to suggest continuity without explanation. This was the moment when attention became unavoidable. Not because the system sought it, but because the paperwork no longer allowed indifference. What follows is not a dramatic intervention, but a procedural one. The response did not come in the form of punishment or proclamation. It came through modification, through silence, through the gradual interruption of continuity. The system did what it had been designed to do when faced with documentation it could not absorb. It corrected itself. To understand why Jabari Mansa's presence in the records triggered a response, it is necessary to understand what memory represented within the system that governed slavery. Memory was not dangerous because it inspired resistance. It was dangerous because it created continuity where none was supposed to exist. The administrative structure of slavery relied on interruption. People could be moved, renamed, reassigned, or absorbed into different records without consequence as long as their past did not travel with them. Memory, when preserved, undermined this process. It allowed individuals to remain legible across time. Legibility was not a moral concern, it was a logistical one. A system that treated human beings as property required that those individuals remain difficult to trace. When memory entered the record, it threatened to turn interchangeable labor into identifiable persons. That transformation did not require recognition of humanity. It required only recognition of continuity. Continuity produced claims. Claims did not need to be voiced to exist. They emerged implicitly through documentation. A remembered origin suggested lineage. A consistent name suggested stability. A repeated reference suggested permanence. None of these were legally required. All of them were administratively inconvenient. Memory forced the system to confront relationships it had been designed to ignore. For enslaved individuals, remembering one's origins was not in itself a challenge to authority. But when that memory became legible to administrators, when it entered correspondence, logs, or internal reports, it disrupted the logic of disposability. A person who could be located within a chain of records was no longer entirely abstract. This distinction mattered most in matters of transfer and valuation. Labor could be moved freely when identity remained vague. But when documentation followed an individual across locations, it created inconsistencies the system was not prepared to resolve. Property could be reassigned, memory could not. The danger was not that memory revealed injustice, the danger was that memory required acknowledgement. Acknowledgement created responsibility. Responsibility created obligation, and obligation introduced friction into a system that depended on efficiency. Jabari Mansa's memory did not survive because it was preserved intentionally. It survived because it became administratively necessary. Officials were forced to refer to prior records to explain present ones. In doing so, they created chains that could not easily be broken. Each reference relied on the existence of a previous one. Each document pointed backward, even when it was designed only to function in the present. This backward reference was not standard practice. It was a deviation that emerged under pressure. The system did not interpret this as a philosophical problem, it interpreted it as a malfunction. Malfunctions are not debated, they are corrected. Memory, when it could not be erased entirely, was managed, it was fragmented. References were isolated, continuity was interrupted wherever possible. The goal was not to eliminate all traces, but to prevent those traces from forming a coherent sequence. In this way, the system maintained the appearance of order. Records continued to exist, documentation continued to function, but the connective tissue that allowed memory to persist was gradually removed. This was not achieved through a single action. It occurred through accumulation of small decisions. A reference omitted here, a name altered there, a document filed without linkage. None of these actions required justification. Each one restored administrative normalcy. What made memory dangerous was not its content but its structure. It linked the past to the present in ways the system could not control. And when systems cannot control continuity, they seek to interrupt it. By the time attention became focused on Jabari Mansa, the issue was no longer his existence. It was the existence of a sequence, a chain of references that suggested stability where instability was required. The response that followed was not a reaction to rebellion, it was a reaction to coherence. When the system responded to Jabari Mansa, it did not do so through confrontation. There was no recorded declaration, no formal accusation, no public acknowledgement of irregularity. The response unfolded through paperwork. Administrative systems rarely announce correction, they implement it. The earliest signs of response appear not as action, but as alteration. References begin to change. Language becomes less precise. Names are adjusted slightly, not enough to draw attention, but enough to interrupt continuity. What had once appeared consistent begins to fracture. This was not error, it was method. Records that previously pointed backward no longer do so. Documents that had relied on earlier entries are revised to stand alone. Cross references disappear. Where linkage had formed, isolation was restored. The system did not need to erase every mention. It needed only to prevent accumulation. A record could exist as long as it remained terminal. What could not be allowed was sequence. This is why erasure appears uneven. Some references survive, others do not. The absence is not total, it is selective. The goal was not to eliminate Jabari Mansa from the archives, but to dissolve the connective tissue that made his presence disruptive. Classification plays a central role in this process. Entries are reassigned to broader categories. Specific identifiers are replaced with generalized designations. Details that once suggested continuity are omitted under the appearance of standardization. The record becomes less informative but more stable. This type of adjustment required no extraordinary authority. Clerks were empowered to standardize. Registrars were instructed to maintain consistency. No single decision needed justification because each adjustment aligned with existing administrative norms. Silence was the most effective tool. Records stop explaining themselves, gaps appear without comment, the absence of annotation signals finality. What is not connected does not need to be reconciled. In some cases, documentation that might have required acknowledgement is redirected, filed under different headings. archived without index, preserved, but rendered inaccessible to comparison. The system did not destroy these materials. Destruction would have drawn attention. Instead, it neutralized them. Neutralization is quieter than erasure. As this process unfolded, Jabari Mansa ceased to appear as a sequence and reverted to a set of isolated references. Each mention could be treated as independent. Each instance could be dismissed as incidental. The problem of continuity was resolved without being addressed. This response was not punitive, it was corrective. Administrative systems respond to disruption by restoring predictability. The goal is not justice, it is functionality. By the time the adjustments were complete, the system had achieved its objective. Documentation existed, but it no longer behaved in a way that required explanation. Memory had been fragmented, continuity had been interrupted, the system moved forward. What remained was not absence, but silence. A silence that did not signify ignorance, but resolution. The issue had been managed, and like most administrative solutions, it left behind no record of its own implementation. Despite the system's efforts to restore administrative order, Jabari Mansa did not disappear entirely. Traces remain not because they were protected and not because they were meant to be found, but because erasure within complex bureaucracies is rarely complete. What survives does so unevenly. Administrative systems are designed to manage the present. Their relationship to the past is incidental. Documents are preserved not because they are important, but because they are attached to processes that require retention. When paperwork serves multiple functions, fragments persist even after their original relevance has been neutralized. This is how archival residue forms. Some records remain because they were embedded within unrelated transactions. A reference survives in a property dispute because removing it would have required revisiting settled claims. A name appears in correspondence preserved for logistical reasons rather than personal significance. The document is retained, but its context is stripped. Survival in this sense is accidental. Archives do not preserve stories, they preserve obligations. Court documents, for example, are often retained long after the individuals involved have ceased to matter administratively. The case remains because the decision affects precedent, jurisdiction, or procedure. Names within those documents persist because removing them would compromise the integrity of the file, not because the individuals themselves were deemed important. In these cases, Jabari Mansa appears not as a subject, but as a byproduct. Other references survive because they were never properly indexed, filed under broad categories, misclassified, buried among materials that were rarely consulted after their initial use. These documents remain intact but functionally invisible. They exist without connection. Disconnection is preservation's quiet companion. In some instances, the survival of records reflects institutional inertia. Bureaucracies resist revisiting completed work. Once a file is closed, reopening it introduces uncertainty. It is often easier to leave fragments untouched than to risk disrupting established order. This is especially true when the fragments no longer behave disruptively. A reference that does not connect to others no longer poses a problem. It can remain without consequence. What survives, therefore, is not the most meaningful material, it is the material that no longer threatens coherence. This explains why surviving references to Jabari Mansa often appear incomplete. Names without explanation, mentions without follow up, records that confirm presence without establishing continuity. Each fragment exists independently, stripped of the relationships that once made it significant. This fragmentation was not reversed by later archivists. Archives are custodial, not interpretive. They preserve what they receive, they do not reconstruct what was interrupted. As a result, what remains is not a narrative. It is a pattern of absence. The gaps are as informative as the documents themselves. Where continuity should exist, it does not. Where reference should lead to reference, the trail stops. These interruptions are not random, they reflect decisions made at the moment when coherence became inconvenient. In this way, the archive records not only what happened but how it was managed. The presence of fragments does not indicate failure of erasure, it indicates success. The system achieved its objective by preventing accumulation, not by eliminating evidence. What survives is evidence rendered inert. For historians, this creates a challenge. The archive cannot be read as a complete account. It must be read as a record of administrative priorities. What is preserved reflects what no longer required attention. Jabari Mansa's surviving traces do not tell us who he was in full. They tell us where the system ceased to care, where memory was no longer threatening, where continuity had been sufficiently disrupted. This distinction matters. The survival of records is often mistaken for transparency. In reality, it reflects constraint. Archives show us the limits of what could be erased without destabilizing the system that produced them. What remains of Jabari Mansa exists because it could remain without consequence. The danger had been neutralized. The sequence had been broken. The system no longer needed to intervene, and so the fragments stayed. They do not restore the story that was interrupted, they mark the point at which interruption became complete. The story of Jabari Mansa does not end with recovery. There is no final revelation. No missing document appears to restore what was interrupted. What remains is not resolution, but understanding. This was never a story about an individual whose life could be fully reconstructed. It is a story about a system whose behavior can be traced. The records do not tell us who Jabari Mansa was in totality. They tell us something more precise. They tell us what the system could tolerate and what it could not. They reveal the boundaries within which documentation was allowed to function. What unsettled the system was not rebellion, it was not defiance, it was coherence. A sequence formed where none was supposed to exist. A name persisted where names were meant to dissolve. Memory behaved in ways the administrative structure could not flatten without adjustment. The response was not dramatic because it did not need to be. Systems rarely announce correction. They implement it quietly through procedure, through omission, through silence. This silence should not be mistaken for absence. The absence we encounter in the archive is not the result of neglect. It is the result of design. The gaps reflect decisions made to preserve functionality, not truth. What was removed was not dangerous knowledge, but disruptive continuity. This distinction matters. Archives are often treated as neutral repositories. In reality, they are products of administrative logic. They preserve what systems could afford to remember and discard what systems could not manage. What survives of Jabari Mansa does not restore his story. It marks the point at which the system succeeded in preventing that story from continuing. That success did not require destruction, it required only interruption. This pattern did not apply to one individual, it applied wherever memory threatened to create obligation, wherever continuity suggested recognition, wherever records behaved in ways the system could not absorb. Jabari Mansa is not exceptional because he was erased. He is exceptional because the erasure can still be observed. The fragments that remain are not clues waiting to be solved. They are evidence of administrative response. They show us how systems defend themselves, not through force, but through structure. Understanding this changes how history is read. It shifts attention away from singular acts of injustice and toward procedural behavior, toward the quiet mechanisms that shape what becomes legible over time. The danger of memory was never that it inspired resistance, the danger was that it created coherence. And when coherence emerges within systems designed to suppress it, interruption becomes inevitable. The archive does not speak loudly, it speaks through pattern, through silence, through what refuses to connect. What remains of Jabari Mansa exists not to complete a story, but to demonstrate how stories are prevented from forming. That is what survives.